After a vicious attack, an elderly veteran began gasping for air and suddenly collapsed as his pacemaker gave out. The crowd watched helplessly, convinced it was already too late until a royal guard stepped in and did something completely unexpected. What happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. But before we reveal it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And be sure to subscribe, because tomorrow at the same time, we'll share another powerful story highlighting the courage and discipline of the Royal Guard. You won't want to miss it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, its golden rays catching the pristine red fabric of the Queen's Guard uniforms. Among the crowds of tourists snapping photos and chattering excitedly in a dozen different languages, one figure stood apart from the rest. James Wilson, 73 years old, moved slowly through the throng of visitors, his weathered hand gripping a simple wooden cane that had been his constant companion for the past 5 years. James had served in the Royal Navy for 22 years, sailing the world's oceans during some of Britain's most challenging times. The medals tucked away in his small London flat: the Naval General Service Medal, the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal, told the story of a man who had dedicated his life to something greater than himself. But those days felt like a lifetime ago now. His body, once strong enough to haul lines in North Sea storms, now required careful management. The pacemaker, surgically implanted in his chest 3 years earlier, kept his heart beating steadily, but it was a constant reminder of his mortality. On this particular Tuesday morning, James had decided to visit the palace. It wasn't his first time here, but something had drawn him back. Perhaps it was the need to connect with the institution he had served for so many years, or maybe it was simply the desire to feel part of something larger than his quiet retirement. He had dressed carefully that morning, putting on his old naval cap, faded but clean, and the jacket he reserved for special occasions. As he approached the famous gates, James couldn't help but notice the young guard standing at attention. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of military bearing that James recognized immediately. His name tag read Bennett, and though his face was expressionless in the traditional manner of the Queen's Guard, James could see the intelligence in his eyes. Bennett had been standing there since the changing of the guard ceremony 2 hours earlier, motionless as a statue, his rifle held at the precise angle dictated by centuries of tradition. What James didn't know was that Bennett shared more with him than might be apparent. The young guardsman had grown up in Manchester, the son of a factory worker and a nurse. He had joined the army at 18, driven by a desire to serve and to find purpose in his life. After completing his basic training with distinction, he had volunteered for medical training, spending months learning emergency first aid, trauma response, and life-saving techniques. It was this combination of military discipline and medical knowledge that had earned him his position with the Queen's Guard, though such skills were rarely called upon during ceremonial duties. The crowd around the palace gates was typical for a Tuesday morning, a mix of tourists, school groups, and locals, showing visiting relatives the sights of London. Among them, moving with a different energy entirely, was Ray Martinez. At 30, Ray carried himself with the swagger of a man perpetually angry at the world. His morning had already gone poorly. He had been fired from his job at a construction site the day before for showing up late and arguing with his supervisor. His girlfriend had thrown him out of her flat after discovering he had spent their rent money at a pub. Now, hungover and bitter, he was walking aimlessly through London with nowhere to go and no one to blame but everyone else. Ray's eyes swept over the crowd. With contempt, he saw the tourists with their expensive cameras and guidebooks, the families laughing and taking selfies, the general contentment that seemed to surround him like a mockery of his own misery. His gaze settled on James, who was standing near the gate, reading a small placard about the history of the Queen's Guard. Something about the old man's obvious reverence for the place irritated Ray. Here was someone who clearly believed in all this royal nonsense, this outdated pomp and ceremony that Ray saw as a symbol of everything wrong with British society. James, unaware of Ray's hostile attention, continued reading about the regiment's history. He was thinking about his own service, remembering the pride he had felt when he first put on his naval uniform. The memories were bittersweet now. His wife Margaret had died 4 years ago, and his only son lived in Australia with his own family. James often felt invisible in modern London, just another elderly man that younger people looked through rather than at. As James moved closer to get a better view of the guards, Ray decided to make his move. It started smaller, deliberate shoulder bump as he passed. James stumbled slightly, but caught himself with his cane, looking up with the patient expression of someone accustomed to life's minor inconveniences. "Excuse me," James said politely, assuming it had been an accident. Ray stopped and turned, his face already flushed with the kind of artificial anger that some people use to justify their worst impulses. "Watch where you're going, old man," he said loudly enough to draw attention from nearby tourists. The words hung in the air like a challenge. James, despite his age and frailty, felt a familiar stirring in his chestnut, his heart condition. But the old naval pride that had never quite left him. He had faced down storms at sea and difficult situations in foreign ports. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a bully in his own country. "Son," James replied with quiet dignity, "I believe you were the one who bumped into me. Perhaps you meant to apologize." The confrontation that followed would be replayed countless times on social media, analyzed by news programs, and remembered by everyone present for years to come. But in the moment, it felt both lightning quick and agonizingly slow. Ree's face darkened at James's calm response. The old man's refusal to be intimidated felt like a personal insult to someone already looking for a fight. A small crowd began to form around them, that peculiar mix of curiosity and concern that gathers whenever public tension begins to escalate. Some pulled out their phones, others simply watched with the kind of horrified fascination that accompanies unexpected drama. "Apologize." Ree's voice rose to a shout. "You entitled old fool. You think because you're wearing that stupid hat that you own this place." James felt his heart begin to race, not from fear but from the kind of righteous anger that had sustained him through decades of military service. His grip tightened on his cane, not as a weapon but as an anchor to keep him steady. "I think," he said with the kind of measured tone that often preceded storms, "that basic courtesy costs nothing, regardless of age." What happened next would later be described differently by different witnesses. Some said Ray seemed to lose control completely. Others insisted they could see calculation in his movements, as if he had decided that humiliating an elderly man would somehow restore his own sense of power. The truth, as is often the case, was probably somewhere in between. Ray stepped forward aggressively, his hands clenched into fists. "Courtesy, from some broken-down old soldier who should have died years ago." The words hit James like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, he had heard worse in his naval days, but because they carried with them the weight of every lonely evening in his empty flat, every birthday card that never came, every reminder that he was increasingly irrelevant in a world that had moved on without him. But James Susan had not survived 22 years in the Royal Navy by backing down from bullies. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and spoke with a voice that carried across the courtyard. "I served this country with honor for over 2 decades. I've earned the right to stand here just as much as you have." The words were barely out of his mouth when Ree's hand shot out, connecting with James's chest in a vicious push that sent the elderly man stumbling backward. James's cane flew from his grasp, clattering across the pavement as he fought desperately to maintain his balance. For a moment, it seemed he might recover. He might catch himself against the metal barrier that separated the tourists from the palace grounds, but then his feet tangled, his weakened legs gave way, and James Wilson collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud that seemed to echo off the palace walls. The silence that followed James's fall was profound and terrible. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone present realizes simultaneously that something has gone horribly wrong, that what had seemed like a simple altercation has crossed a line into something far more serious. James lay motionless on the cold pavement, his naval cap fallen beside him, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were closed, and the shallow, irregular breathing that had followed his fall was becoming increasingly labored. The pacemaker in his chest, designed to regulate his heartbeat during normal activity, was struggling to cope with the sudden shock and stress of the fall. Ray stood frozen, his hands still extended from the push, his face cycling through a range of emotions: surprise, fear, and then a desperate attempt at justification. "He's faking it," he said to no one in particular, his voice cracking slightly. "Old people do this all the time. He's just trying to get me in trouble." But even as he spoke the words, Ray could see that James was not faking anything. The old man's skin was taking on a grayish pallor, and his breathing was becoming more and more shallow. A woman in the crowd let out a small scream. Someone shouted for help. Others began pulling out their phones, some to call for emergency services, others to record what was happening. In the midst of this chaos, 30 feet away, Bennett remained at his post. The Queen's Guard are trained to maintain their positions regardless of what happens around them. They are living symbols of British stoicism and discipline, expected to remain motionless through rain, snow, tourist harassment, and even minor emergencies. The protocol is clear. Do not break character. Do not abandon your post. Do not react to civilian incidents unless specifically ordered to do so by a superior officer. But Bennett was also a trained medic, and his medical training was screaming at him that the man on the ground was in serious trouble. He could see from his position that James's breathing was becoming increasingly erratic. He could observe the telltale signs of someone whose cardiovascular system was shutting down. Every instinct developed through months of emergency medical training was telling him that this was not a situation that could wait for the proper authorities to arrive. The internal struggle that Bennett faced in those few seconds would have been invisible to casual observers, but it was profound. On one side was centuries of military tradition, the explicit orders he had received about maintaining his post, and the knowledge that breaking protocol could end his career with the Queen's Guard. On the other side was a human being who was dying in front of him, and a certain knowledge that he possessed the skills that might save that person's life. The decision, when it came, was almost instantaneous. Bennett had been raised by parents who taught him that duty to humanity superseded duty to institutions. His father had been laid off from the factory where he worked for 15 years, but he had never lost his belief that ordinary people had an obligation to help each other when help was needed. His mother had spent countless nights providing unpaid care to neighbors and friends, believing that medical knowledge came with the responsibility to use it when lives were at stake. In one fluid motion that seemed to surprise even himself, Bennett stepped away from his post. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that several tourists gasped. Queen's Guards simply did not move without orders. They certainly did not abandon their ceremonial duties to rush towards civilian incidents. But Bennett was no longer thinking like a ceremonial guard. He was thinking like a medic, like someone whose training had prepared him for exactly this kind of emergency. As he moved toward James, his mind was already running through the protocols he had learned. Assess the scene for safety, check for responsiveness, evaluate breathing and circulation, begin life-saving measures as appropriate. The crowd parted before him as he approached, his military bearing and obvious sense of purpose creating a clear path to where James lay. Bennett dropped to his knees beside the elderly man, his hands already moving to check for a pulse at James's neck. The skin was cold and clammy, and Bennett could immediately tell that James's circulation was severely compromised. "Sir, can you hear me?" Bennett's voice was steady, professional, cutting through the ambient noise of the crowd. There was no response. James's eyes remained closed, his breathing so shallow as to be almost imperceptible. Bennett's training took over completely. He tilted James's head back slightly to open his airway, placed his ear close to the man's mouth to listen for breathing sounds. What he heard confirmed his worst fears. James was barely breathing, and his heart was clearly not pumping effectively. This was not a simple faint or a minor injury from the fall. This was cardiac arrest, likely triggered by the stress of the confrontation and the physical trauma of hitting the ground. Without hesitation, Bennett positioned his hands over James's chest and began CPR. The compressions were deep, rhythmic, and precisely the result of countless hours of training and practice. 30 compressions, followed by 2 rescue breaths, then 30 more compressions. The technique was textbook perfect, but the situation was anything but routine. The crowd that had formed around them watched in stunned silence. Many had never seen CPR performed outside of television medical dramas, and the reality was both more clinical and more desperate than anything they had imagined. Bennett's face was a mask of concentration, his entire being focused on the rhythm of compressions and breaths that might bring James back from the edge of death. As Bennett worked, the crowd's attention began to shift between the drama of the life-saving efforts and the man who had caused the crisis in the first place. Ray had initially tried to fade into the background, hoping that he could somehow slip away unnoticed in the confusion. But the age of smartphones meant that his actions had been recorded from multiple angles, and several bystanders had made it clear that they had no intention of letting him escape. "That's him," a middle-aged woman shouted, pointing at Ray. "He's the one who pushed the old man." Ray's face flushed with panic and anger. "I barely touched him, he was already sick." "You can't blame me for his heart problems." But even as he protested his innocence, Ree's own words betrayed his understanding of the situation. He knew that James had heart problems. The man had been wearing a medical alert bracelet that was visible to anyone who looked closely. He knew that pushing an elderly person with a medical condition was dangerous. He had chosen to do it anyway. Driven by his own anger and frustration, a young man with a London accent stepped forward, his phone held high to continue recording. "Mate, we all saw what happened. You had a go at an old war veteran. Now he's dying because of you." The word dying seemed to hit Ray like a physical blow. Despite his attempts at justification, he could see that James was not moving, that the guard was performing CPR with the kind of desperate intensity that suggested this was life or death. The reality of what he had done, what he might have, Cosby began to sink in. Meanwhile, Bennett continued his efforts with unwavering focus. His military training had taught him to function under pressure, to maintain clarity of thought, even in chaotic situations. But this was different from anything he had experienced before. In training exercises, the casualties were simulated, the outcomes predetermined. Here, he was fighting for the life of a real person, an elderly veteran who had simply been trying to enjoy a peaceful morning at the palace. The physical demands of CPR are intense. Each compression requires significant force to adequately compress the chest and stimulate the heart. Bennett could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Despite the cool morning air, his arms were starting to ache from the repetitive motion, but he couldn't afford to slow down or reduce the effectiveness of his technique. After what felt like hours, but was actually only 3 minutes, Bennett paused to check for signs of recovery. He placed his fingers on James's neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. The man's color remained poor, his breathing non-existent. Bennett immediately resumed CPR, this time with even greater intensity. It was during this second round of compressions that sirens could be heard in the distance. The London ambulance service responding to the emergency calls that had been made by multiple witnesses. But Bennett knew that every second counted. Brain damage from lack of oxygen could begin within 4 to 6 minutes of cardiac arrest. The paramedics might arrive in time, but they might not. The sound of approaching sirens seemed to galvanize the crowd. Some people began clearing a path for the emergency responders, while others continued to document what was happening. The gravity of the situation was becoming apparent to everyone present. This was not a minor incident that would be forgotten by evening. This was a moment that would have consequences, both immediate and long-term. Ray, meanwhile, was discovering that his attempts to blend into the crowd were completely futile. In an age where everyone carried a high-definition camera in their pocket, his actions had been captured from multiple angles. Worse still, several witnesses had already uploaded their footage to social media platforms, where the incident was beginning to go viral under hashtags like #Buckingham Palace assault and #veteran attacked. But Ree's problems were about to become much more immediate. 2 Metropolitan Police officers, responding to reports of an assault, had arrived on the scene and were pushing through the crowd toward him. Their presence seemed to drain what little color remained from Ree's face. "Are you the individual who assaulted the elderly gentleman?" one of the officers asked, though it was clear from his tone that this was more of a statement than a question. Ree's response was a mixture of panic and continued denial. "I didn't assault anyone. He fell. Old people fall all the time." The officer looked at him with the kind of professional skepticism that comes from years of hearing criminals attempt to justify their actions. "Sir, we have multiple witnesses and video evidence. I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of assault causing grievous bodily harm." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Ray seemed to finally understand the magnitude of what was happening. His eyes darted toward where Bennett was still performing CPR on James, and for the first time, something that might have been genuine remorse flickered across his features. The arrival of the paramedics brought a new sense of urgency to the scene. 2 emergency medical technicians pushed through the crowd with their equipment, their professional demeanor immediately apparent. They moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from years of responding to life-threatening emergencies. "How long has he been down?" the lead paramedic asked Bennett as he positioned a defibrillator beside James. "Approximately 6 minutes," Bennett replied without breaking his compression rhythm. "Witnessed cardiac arrest following a physical altercation. Patient is approximately 70 years old, appears to have a pacemaker based on visible scarring." The paramedic nodded, impressed by Bennett's clinical assessment and the quality of his CPR technique. "You're doing excellent work. Let's get him connected to the monitor." What happened next would later be described by witnesses as miraculous, though the medical professionals involved knew it was the result of good training, quick action, and perhaps a measure of luck. The paramedics attached the defibrillator pads to James's chest and analyzed his heart rhythm. The machine recommended a shock, and everyone stepped back as the electrical current coursed through the elderly man's body. James's back arched slightly with the shock, then he fell still again. The paramedics immediately resumed CPR while Bennett stepped back to give them room to work. His part in the drama was largely finished, but he remained close by, watching intently for any signs of improvement. After another minute of CPR, one of the paramedics checked for a pulse. This time, there was something there, weak and irregular, but unmistakably present. "We've got him back," the paramedic announced, and a collective sigh of relief seemed to rise from the crowd. James's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. He tried to speak, but only managed to produce a weak cough. The paramedics immediately began preparing him for transport to the hospital, attaching 4 lines and monitoring equipment while speaking to him in calm, reassuring tones. "You're going to be all right, sir," one of them said. "You've had a cardiac episode, but we've got you stabilized. We're going to take you to hospital now." As James was loaded onto a stretcher, his eyes found Bennett, who was standing at attention nearby, having returned to something approximating his ceremonial posture. Despite his weakness, James managed to raise his hand in a trembling saluter gesture from one veteran to another, a recognition of service and sacrifice that transcended their different generations and branches of military service. Bennett, still bound by protocol, could not return the salute while in his ceremonial uniform, but those watching closely could see his eyes soften slightly. A brief acknowledgement of the connection between 2 men who had dedicated their lives to serving something greater than themselves. The ambulance departed with its lights flashing and sirens wailing, carrying James toward the specialized cardiac unit at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The immediate crisis was over, but the implications of what had happened were only beginning to unfold. Ray, meanwhile, was being loaded into a police vehicle for transport to the local station. The charges against him were serious assault causing grievous bodily harm, potentially attempted manslaughter if the prosecution decided to pursue maximum charges. His actions had been witnessed by dozens of people and recorded by multiple cameras. His defense options were limited. In the aftermath of the incident, as the crowd began to disperse and normal tourist activities slowly resumed, Bennett faced his own moment of reckoning. He had broken protocol in the most public way possible, abandoning his ceremonial post to provide medical assistance. By strict military standards, his actions could be seen as a serious breach of discipline. Within an hour, Bennett found himself standing at attention in front of his commanding officer, Captain Williams, in a small office within the palace complex. The captain was a career military man in his 50s, someone who had risen through the ranks by following orders and maintaining discipline. His face was unreadable as he reviewed the initial reports of the incident. "Guardsman Bennett," Captain Williams began, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. "You are aware that abandoning your post is a serious offense under military law?" "Yes, sir," Bennett replied, staring straight ahead in the traditional manner of a soldier being addressed by a superior officer. "You are also aware that the Queen's Guard represents the highest standards of discipline and protocol in the British Army?" "Yes, sir." Captain Williams was quiet for a long moment, consulting additional papers on his desk. "The incident this morning has been widely reported. Your actions are being discussed on social media, in the press, and likely in Parliament. Before the day is over." Bennett remained silent, understanding that these were not questions requiring answers. However, the captain continued, "I have also received a preliminary report from the London Ambulance Service. The paramedic supervisor who responded to the scene has indicated that your immediate action and the quality of your CPR were likely decisive factors in saving Mr. Wilson's life." For the first time since entering the office, Bennett's rigid posture showed a slight change. Not relief, was too early for that, but perhaps a small measure of hope that his actions might be understood in their proper context. Captain Williams set down the papers and looked directly at Bennett for the first time during the meeting. "Guardsman, you are faced with an impossible choice this morning. Protocol demanded that you remain at your post. Humanity demanded that you act to save a life. In making the choice you did, you represented the very best of what the British Army stands for." The words hung in the air for a moment before the captain continued. "There will be an investigation, as required by regulations. However, I am recommending that you be commended for your actions, rather than disciplined. The Queen's Guard exists to serve the Crown and the people of Britain. Today, he was served both." The story of what happened that morning outside Buckingham Palace spread far beyond London, far beyond Britain. In an age of social media and instant global communication, the video footage of Bennett breaking protocol to save James's life was shared millions of times within hours. The incident became a symbol of human decency, triumphing over rigid bureaucracy, of individual moral courage, overcoming institutional constraints. James Wilson recovered fully from his cardiac episode, though it took several weeks in the hospital and months of rehabilitation. When he was finally well enough to give interviews, he spoke with deep gratitude about the young guardsman who had saved his life. "He didn't know me from Adam," James told reporters, "but he saw someone who needed help, and he helped. That's what real soldiers do." Ray Martinez was sentenced to 18 months in prison for assault causing grievous bodily harm. The judge who sentenced him noted that his actions had not only endangered an elderly veteran, but had also forced a serving soldier to choose between duty and conscience. Ray served 14 months of his sentence before being released on parole. He never publicly apologized for his actions, though witnesses reported that he seemed genuinely shaken during his trial when medical experts testified about how close James had come to dying. Bennett continued his service with the Queen's Guard. Though his life was forever changed by the events of that morning, he received numerous commendations, including recognition from military leadership and civilian authorities. More importantly, he received letters from around the world from veterans who thanked him for honoring their service, from medical professionals who praised his life-saving skills, and from ordinary people who saw in his actions a reminder that individual choices matter. The incident led to a review of Queen's Guard protocols. Though the basic principles remained unchanged, guards were reminded that while ceremonial duties were important, they were still soldiers and medical personnel first, with responsibilities that transcended rigid adherence to protocol in life-threatening situations. Perhaps the most significant outcome was the friendship that developed between James and Bennett. Despite their difference in age and background, they found common ground in their shared commitment to service and their understanding of what it means to put others before oneself. James began visiting Bennett's family regularly, becoming something of a grandfather figure to Bennett's younger siblings. Years later, when asked about that morning at Buckingham Palace, Bennett would say that he had simply done what anyone in his position should have done, but those who witnessed his actions knew better. In a moment when protocol and humanity came into conflict, he had chosen humanity. In doing so, he had reminded everyone present that the highest form of duty is not blind obedience to rules, but thoughtful service to the needs of others. The palace gates remain a symbol of tradition and protocol, as they have for centuries. But for those who were there that morning, they represent something else as well: the understanding that true strength lies not in rigid adherence to rules, but in the wisdom to know when those rules must be set aside in service of something greater. In the end, that may be the most royal virtue of all.